Russia's President Vladimir Putin has warned his United States counterpart Joe Biden that imposing new sanctions over his feud with Ukraine could lead to a complete breakdown in relations. In a phone call, the Russian president said such sanctions would be a colossal mistake. But President Biden said Mr. Putin that the U.S. and his allies would respond decisively to any invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We have details in this report.
The call between the U.S. President Joe Biden and his Russian counterpart was requested by Russia. The telephone conversation between both men lasted for almost an hour. It marked the latest efforts to de-escalate tension between Russia and Ukraine over Ukraine's claims that Russia has deployed more than 100,000 troops to its eastern border. The build-up has prompted concern in the West, with the U.S. threatening the Russian President Vladimir Putin with sanctions like never seen before if he dares to attack Ukraine. Russia, however, denies it is planning to invade Ukraine, insisting troops sent into its eastern border are there for exercises. The Russian government also emphasized it is entitled to move its troops freely on its own soil. U.S. President Joe Biden has strictly maintained that substantive progress in dialogues with Russia can only occur in an environment of de-escalation of tension. Mr. Biden has made it clear that the United States and its allies will respond decisively if Russia further invades Ukraine. U.S. and Russian officials are set to meet for talks in Geneva next month, and the White House says Mr. Biden is urging his Russian counterpart to pursue a diplomatic solution. In a holiday message before Thursday's call, the Russian president said he was convinced he could work with President Biden based on mutual respect and consideration of each side's national interests. His spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said Russia was in the mood for conversation. Ukraine's defense minister had told parliament at the start of December that Russia had massed tens of thousands of troops near the border and could be gearing up for a large-scale military offensive at the end of January. Russia argues that the military build-up at the border is a protective measure against NATO, the Western military alliance. It wants legally binding guarantees that NATO will not expand further east and that certain weapons will not be sent to Ukraine or any neighboring country. But the U.S. has rejected Russia's demand, describing it as a bid to control the future of independent nations. The tension between Russia and Ukraine is long-running. In 2014, Russia annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, and soon after, started to back a separatist insurgency in the eastern part of Ukraine that has seen some 14,000 people killed in periodic fighting. Washington and its European allies have warned Russia to expect severe economic sanctions if its troops cross into Ukraine again.
And joining me virtually now from Washington for an analysis of this situation is a global affairs analyst, Calvin Dack. Good to have you join us.
Good to be here.
So this is the second virtual summit between President Biden and President Putin in a month. That's unprecedented. But one of the things that, people have commended that level of engagement, but we also see the posturing in these conversations, the tone of the conversation. While on one hand, it is commendable in terms of the pace of diplomatic pace of conversation, but help us make sense of all of this, or how do you read all of this?
Well, I think one of the first things that I noticed after the readouts from the Kremlin and from the White House is this is one campaign promise that Joe Biden is fulfilling. Remember, he said that he wanted to bring normalcy and a little bit of boring back to U.S. foreign policy. And this is what we're seeing. Because you remember, not a year ago, Donald Trump was our president. And if this had been happening during his term, whatever he had decided, whatever the call would have been about, we would have definitely seen it on Twitter. We would have seen it on statements. It definitely would have been the opposite of de-escalation. And so I think the first thing that I noticed was that Joe Biden and his team made clear that there would be no rash escalation, but it'd be de-escalation. The other thing that I noticed is if you look at the demands that Putin made, clearly they're making demands that, one, they don't have a right to make. You know, how are they going to dictate how far NATO should expand when NATO was created to keep Russia in check? And several other things that, you know, you mentioned in the lead up about the offensive weapons, knowing that the United States isn't going to give on it, but that Joe Biden didn't come back with further escalation, but said we'll continue to talk lower level in the coming months.
I want to get to the demands made by Russia shortly, but let's talk about the step up in diplomatic pace. Do you think that this is an indication of how worried the Biden administration is in terms of tension in Ukraine?
I think that one portion of that is yes. I believe that the Biden administration does believe that the troops aren't surrounding Ukraine just for fun. So they know that something is being planned. But I think the uptick in the diplomatic communication, that reflects more of Joe Biden's desire to engage, because he wants, you know, engage at his level with Putin, but also at the lower level. So I think it's not a sign that they are nervous. It's a sign that they know the situation is serious and that they're going to give diplomacy as much room as possible.
So let's get to the demands made by Russia. One of them is that there should be legally binding guarantees that NATO will not expand further in that region, especially in Ukraine. Bearing in mind that just 7 years ago, just barely 7 years ago, that Russia annexed Crimea, what do you see happening if the demands of Russia are not met? Do you see a real threat of invasion or just continuous meddling in Ukraine by Russia? And let's bear in mind that Ukraine is highly divided and politically unstable.
Well, I definitely think that further incursion in the Ukraine is possible, as you mentioned what happened in 2014. But I think what's also important to keep in mind is that Joe Biden has been here as in 2014, although he was vice president at the time. And so he definitely knows what's possible. And when it comes to the demands that Putin was, you know, asking for, what happens with NATO and the U.S., that's with NATO and the U.S. and its NATO partners. I know Putin would love to dictate their agenda, but that's not going to be possible. Doesn't stop him from asking. And the third point about that, when it comes to the demands that he's making, particularly not so much the expansion of NATO, but on the providing offensive weapons for Ukraine and other NATO allies, Joe Biden is very, very conscious of the fact that the Republicans here are trying to say that he is weak on foreign policy, weak on Russia. So while he's not going to give in to some of the bigger demands of Putin, he also can't be seen on giving in the little ones, because that will feed into the image that he's not standing up to Russia.
And that's the challenge, because the U.S. has taken on this responsibility and burden, as it were, of protecting its weaker allies and weaker in terms of military power, whether it's Israel against Iran or South Korea and Taiwan against China and Ukraine against Russia. There is that protection coming from a responsibility of protection coming from the U.S., but also the responsibility to ensure that none of this tension result in a war. Where does this leave the U.S. in terms of its diplomatic relations with these countries?
Well, you know, one dynamic that influences that is when you mentioned, you know, the U.S. coming to the aid of smaller allies. Once again, just a reminder from the Trump administration, you remember he was the one that said pretty boldly that when it came to the articles that required the U.S. and other NATO allies to come to the joint defense of others, he openly said that that was not necessarily on the table in certain circumstances. I think he even said, you know, why are we going to defend countries that some Americans didn't know the name of? And the reason that's important now is as Joe Biden tries to repair U.S. relations with its allies, he's only been in office less than a year. And so he's got to make sure they know that he will stand up and defend alongside them, because those relationships are still very strained.
For U.S. and Russia, we're looking at the stage is now set for a lower level of engagement in January. Quickly, what do you see happening in this engagement?
Well, I think if Putin keeps the status quo, doesn't move the soldiers, but also doesn't make any further encroachments, what'll happen is we'll see a very boring, normal diplomatic conference at the lower level of officials where they will continue to hammer out and try to de-escalate. So I think that's what Joe Biden is attempting to do. Now, like I said, if Putin does something, an encroachment before the beginning of January or the middle of January, it could all be on the table, sanctions and a lot of other things.
Just so much to watch out for in that engagement coming, I think it's 12th and 13th of yes. January. We'll look forward to that conversation. Thank you so much for your time as always. Global Affairs Analyst Calvin Dack.
Thank you.